And I think we're recording. Perfect. So good morning, everyone. My name is Cap. I'm one of the staff counselors and clinical coordinator here at the Villanova University Counseling Center. And I'm joined by Dr. Natalie Sheridan. Natalie, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Natalie Sheridan. I'm a psychologist at the Counseling Center.
And we are here today to speak to you all about skills in coping with academic disappointment and imperfection and how to take care of yourself. So to begin, Natalie, would you mind getting us started?
Sure. So I think it's important to name that, we at Villanova have a very, I think, ambitious student, a very talented student. And I think those students come to college with really certain plans for themselves, right? They plan on being academically successful. They've generally had good grades. That's what got them into the university. And they're really hoping to enjoy that same kind of success in their classes here at Villanova. They often might have plans about professional goals and how they might progress towards them, such as securing like specific internships to land the job they want post-graduation. They have had shadowing opportunities, looking to continue those, and really hoping to excel at graduate level standardized testings like the GRE, LSTAT, MCAT, just like they likely did in their testing opportunities before coming to college. Um, and the social transition, generally they have high expectations as well, right? Like they're going to make good friends. This is going to be a wonderful experience. They're going to have a big social network. All those things I think our Villanova student comes in with. So I just want to acknowledge that as a typical starting point.
Definitely. And when we speak to success, we also have to speak to failure or upset. And unfortunately, failure is a necessary part of every learning and growing experience. We have a number of individuals that have made it that we see to be successful that have said similar things about failure. If you look at all the greats that have achieved a lot, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Michael Jordan, they will speak at length about failures that they've kind of endured and grew through in order to receive or achieve their success. Dave Ramsey once said, success is just a pile of failure that you're standing on. Steve Harvey once said, failure is a part of the journey to success. And Brene Brown also said, if you're brave enough, you're going to fail. So speaking to failure, we also need to normalize it. So Natalie?
Yeah. So again, like, I think oftentimes students at our university may have their first failure experience in the on the Villanova track, right? And so we need to understand it as well. It might be your first experience. It's really a very normal part of your academic journey. Anyone who like, if you've never made a mistake, you really haven't tried to do anything. I think feeling confused or unsure, making mistakes is really part of the learning process. And I think as material gets more and more difficult, that experience of feeling confused or stuck is just something we have to tolerate and understand as part of the journey. There's no innovation, learning, or creativity without taking the risk of failing. And how we manage those feelings, how we tolerate those feelings of failure, uncertainty, are really, really important. And they make a very significant difference in how we move forward. And I think that's what we're going to be talking a lot more about as the presentation continues.
Absolutely. And speaking to those internal responses when it comes to failure, sometimes we can see that manifest as panicking, stress, anxiety. That then has a flight of ideas associated with it, like feeling like we're not understanding the material or performing well in a specific type of class. Sometimes permanency can get involved, thinking that we'll never be able to understand the material or perform well in that specific class. We have subvariants of FOMO, if you will, comparing ourselves to others and feeling shameful about our performance when we compare ourselves to our peers or our cohort. And then further allowing for that to manifest, thinking about our professors and maybe their judgment on us and our performance. That then can ripple out further into acting like we may have done something wrong by not understanding the material. And that then gets into ideas around imposter syndrome. And if we allow for these thoughts to manifest and continue to manifest without even addressing them, those setbacks can sometimes create a low self-worth or determine our worth, which can result in low self-esteem, a defeatist attitude, depression, sometimes even apathy towards our classes, which would then kind of limit our efforts for the rest of the semester. And we may start engaging in avoidance coping and procrastination. And I think we're going to be speaking to avoidance coping with a definition in our next slide.
Yeah, right here. So what is avoidance coping? Avoidance is typically a response to anxiety and can take many forms, including procrastination. We want to normalize that avoidance to some degree is normal. We all avoid responsibilities and challenges in our lives to some degree, although how we do so and why we do so really varies. In general, avoidance coping is a maladaptive form of coping in which a person changes their behavior to avoid thinking about, feeling, or doing difficult things. It's considered maladaptive or unhealthy because it exacerbates the problem without helping a person deal with things that are causing them stress. So avoidance behaviors generally cause more anxiety in the long run. They don't solve a problem. They're less effective than proactive strategies. And that could really minimize the stress. So we're going to talk a little bit about why we avoid.
For sure. But before we do that, what does avoidance coping look like? So examples would include spreading oneself too thin, taking on too many other responsibilities that may or may not have to do with the problem at hand, accepting too many invitations so that one doesn't have time to do the work or face the actual problem. It can also look like staying up later than one should by doing something that could be seen as mindless. An example of that would be binging Netflix episodes, for example, as a way to avoid thinking about problems. Um, Another way that it manifests is it looks like waiting until the last possible moment to do a large assignment in order to keep oneself from doing more work than the minimum. So overextending oneself. We also see this as spending too much time getting ready, sort of preparing to get work done. So that could look like spending too much time cleaning, spending too much time cooking, moving locations, for example. Again, that has little to do with the actual problem at hand. And we also see it as avoidance directly as uh, not looking at emails or assignments and what have you when it relates to the class or the subject matter at hand.
So why do we avoid? Sometimes it's because we don't feel like we have enough time in our lives to do the other things that are important to us. Like we're leaning into pleasure activities because we feel so deprived. So that's a process we want to understand. Sometimes we're trying to avoid feelings of embarrassment, shame, or feelings of inadequacy. Sometimes it's because we feel worried about that we won't perform well. When we finally get in there and attempt to do the assignment or our work. Sometimes we do it because we're worried about how intensely we will work or how high a standard we hold to ourselves when we finally begin the work. And we're going to talk more about how to kind of avoiding as we continue.
And so the ideas of perfectionism kind of have a large role in avoidance coping. So sometimes we're putting off because we put so much pressure on ourselves to produce a near perfect output, and those
Mm.
expectations are so grand. And if we don't achieve them, we fall into this cycle of avoidance coping. So it could be helpful to sit and learn and set limits on how we can kind of reevaluate and readjust our expectations and recognize that some of the indicators that we have um, may be outstanding.
Mm.
And those are good to have for the most part. However, it could also benefit you to reevaluate them and turn in good enough assignments and understand that not every assignment has to be at the best that we can do. It just needs to get done at some times.
Yeah. So how do we address avoidance coping? And a big part of that is recognizing and accepting the feelings that might be driving it. So really becoming aware of what we're feeling and why we're avoiding. So in a way, like kind of turning towards that emotional experience, trying to surrender into rather to avoid those emotions that are keeping you stuck. One way that we can do that is to first recognize that there's going to be relief that we face when we actually move forward, instead of putting things off, even when it's difficult. Try to focus on helping yourself relax and feel comfortable as you take those active steps. Um, Criticism is not helpful. Beating yourself up about what things what things have not been done, whether you're being productive enough. Instead, really leaning into a more compassionate stance that avoidance is part of our everyday experience, not to be hard on yourself for having to avoid or trying to protect yourself from feelings, but rather to hold those feelings with a lot of compassion, and to try to use your body to calm down and focus. So when we get in touch with a lot of the feelings that we've talked about, embarrassment, shame, high expectations, perfectionism, we're usually sitting with a lot of emotional distress and discomfort in our body. And so sitting with those feelings and doing something like relaxing, using relaxation techniques, meditation techniques, can be really useful. And if you want to learn more about them, we have all these other presentations on our YouTube channel that talk more about how to like be taking care of your body in that way.
Absolutely. So those are really great actionable steps. Another really great actionable step that we can take to take action is to take small steps. So addressing the problem in sometimes feels insurmountable. So if you think about climbing Mount Everest, for example, thinking about climbing Mount Everest as this massive thing feels overwhelming and daunting. But if we focus in on taking one step at a time, it may be more digestible for us. So breaking a task, a larger task, into the smallest, simplest steps is a way to get started. And so thinking to ourselves, what is the easiest, tiniest action that I could take to bring me closer towards my goal is the first step that we can do. Following that, once we attain that first step, maybe we try the idea of stacking. So stacking is when we take one active decision and we stack them upon another. So we're taking tiny actionable steps towards this larger goal to build momentum for change. And that hopefully will bridge the gap and take us on a trajectory where we could accomplish our goal. Um, Identify active coping options. So thinking about mindfulness meditation, like Natalie was mentioning in the previous slide, are there other strategies that we can actively use to involve and that involve doing something differently to positively affect your situation is something we need to contemplate. And once we find that item, enact that in your daily living so that we can achieve this insurmountable task that was insurmountable.
We can also talk about adaptive, active ways to coping failed. So accepting strength and weaknesses. So again, this is sort of speaking to the idea of perfectionism that we're going to continue to talk about as really being a barrier to moving forward. So if you see yourself, one way to do that is to see yourself as a whole person with strengths and weaknesses. Remember, just because you didn't measure up in some standard of achievement doesn't mean that we don't possess gifts and talents that we all bring to the world. So again, like not engaging in that all or nothing thinking, if I can't do this, then I'm all bad. Just really acknowledging that we're a person with a lot of strengths and weaknesses across the board. Viewing yourself as someone who can cope with stress, loss, and mistakes by adapting and growing. Remember, if you performed perfectly in all your classes without any structure, then you really wouldn't need an education. Like that's not the learning experience. We want to shift into viewing failure as a meaningful part of our educational journey. And this mindset can boost energy. It can help us move towards productive action. We want to be really aware of the things we're saying to ourselves. So we call that like self-talk in psychology. So you want to change that self-talk. So instead of I'm such a failure, I'll never be able to learn anything, really think of shift and say I'm smart, I'm capable. This is hard, but I can do it. And you want to really respect your efforts. Take stock of what you can change to help yourself and appreciate what you're doing right. I think that's what keeps us motivated and keeps us in the work, doesn't shut us down.
We're going to speak to get gritty. So adaptive ways to cope with failure. Dr. Angela Lee Duckworth identified grit as a way of thinking that can help us persevere in the face of failure, hardship, and stress. It's a determination and mental toughness that can help us stay in it for the long haul. She developed this conceptual framework, if you will, around three specific tenets. So commitment. So if you connect to the passion behind why you're pursuing your degree and continuously revisit that, that should help connect you to the passion and then again help you stay ingrained in the work that you're doing. Secondly, we can challenge, so we can use our failure and mistakes as a challenge or a learning opportunity rather than an active threat. And lastly, she stated that we should control. So invest time and energy on the things that we can control rather
Mhm.
than trying to change the unchangeable. So being gritty involves rethinking the situation, calming our impulses to run away from or avoid in response to stress. We're going to play the entire TED Talk towards the end of this presentation. It's 6 minutes in duration. So for those that want to watch it, we can feel free to stick around and we'll show it.
So this is like talking about perfectionism, and I think it's about thinking about perfectionism differently. Some students, and I think especially our students, will sometimes really identify as perfectionism as having high standards. But perfectionism is a little bit different than that. Perfection often is what keeps us stuck in inaction. And so we really want to shift into viewing perfectionism as a curse disguised as a blessing. So generally when we look at what's driving perfectionism, it's not how can I be my best self. It's often stuck in comparison. What will other people think? It's unrelenting and unrealistic standards that cause people to sacrifice too much health, happiness, and the quality of their relationships. Um, it's trying to manage stress and failure by staying in control, but but being in perfectly control is impossible. It's just not something that we can do. So perfectionism then leads to all this really distressful experience, second guessing, procrastination, feeling overwhelmed, giving up, like all this effort to try to control something that's really just not controllable and honestly part of the learning experience, right? So in order to avoid perfectionism, we shift into self-compassion, accepting that the human condition is flawed and imperfect. It's impossible to be perfect. And I just need to sit with that and be loving with myself about the imperfect state of the of being a human. Taking action to address a mistake or failure will help. So when we hit that self perfectionism, it knocks us down, right? So instead viewing this as like, okay, I've hit a roadblock. What can I be doing now? What action steps can I be taking? How can I orient myself differently towards this? All the things we've already talked about how to avoid avoidance coping. The self-talk that's connected with perfectionism, that self-loathing and shame, they really keep people stuck. It knocks the wind out of your sails, keeps you defeated. So we really want to avoid that kind of thinking. And this is, I think, one of the hardest things to do when you're really stuck in a perfectionistic mindset is setting reasonable limits on your work, reasonable limits about what your expectations are, and just getting started, doing whatever you can to move into action.
Definitely. Adaptive ways to cope with failure, self-compassion is your friend. So I think the theme here is to be compassionate with oneself. Compassion is essential to help stay motivated in the face of hardship. That includes failure or upset, and try to imagine something uh, someone would say to you that would be kind. And if that's hard to imagine, visualize yourself saying something that would be kind to someone that you love, friend, family, whomever, something that you would suggest to them if they were going through a hardship or an upset or a failure, and visualize yourself saying what you would say to them to yourself. So ideas would be failure is really hard, accepting the fact that failure is very hard. Feeling this way is part of the human experience, kind of like the previous slide that Natalie was mentioning. And let me give myself compassion in a way that I need to heal so that I can take those small progressive steps and potentially stack those small progressive steps to have a trajectory that would lead me to the success that I visualize for myself.
Mm.
Um, Also implementing new ways to relieve stress and give yourself the space to really bask in that stress relief. So as we mentioned, the University Counseling Center's YouTube channel is going to be hosting a large amount of meditation. You may hear some familiar voices there. We have deep breathing exercises. Um, you can try journaling. You can try exercise. There's empirical evidence that suggests that being in nature often will relieve stress and creates cascades neurochemically um, that may often be better than medication.
Mm.
We also offer free counseling here at the counseling center. So always remember that we're here for support as well.
And we want to think about another really helpful way to adapt to all these feelings, right? Adaptive ways to cope with those feelings is asking for help. And at the counseling center, we offer free and confidential counseling to any Villanova student. And so asking for help, leaning in and talking with a counselor might really be a good option for you. In asking for help, we end up releasing a lot of shame. And shame is what really keeps us stuck in this place. And I really like the idea that shame can't survive being spoken. It really thrives on this idea of secrecy, silence, and judgment. But when you share those feelings, when you talk about it with someone, it relieves all of those feelings, and it's replaced with support and empathy. So remember that practice makes progress. I really like that expression. Practice doesn't make perfect, because that's impossible, but it does make progress. So practice how you can ask for help. Role playing a conversation with a professor, role playing a conversation with your parent. And of course, you can come in and ask the counselor to support you in that effort too. So this concludes the content. We're going to shift into playing the YouTube video that Cap referenced earlier, and we'll hang out through it, and then we'll conclude. Is technology working?
My internet just stopped.
Okay.
Hold on.
Well,
Tech issue, sorry. Here we go.
Here we go.
When I was 27 years old, I left a very demanding job in management consulting for a job that was even more demanding, teaching. I went to teach 7th graders math in the New York City public schools. And like any teacher, I made quizzes and tests, I gave out homework assignments. When the work came back, I calculated grades. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. The kinds of things you need to learn in 7th grade math, sure, they're hard. Ratios, decimals, the area of a parallelogram. But these concepts are not impossible. And I was firmly convinced that every one of my students could learn the material if they worked hard and long enough. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. In education, the one thing we know how to measure best is IQ. But what if doing well in school and in life depends on much more than your ability to learn quickly and easily? So I left the classroom and I went to graduate school to become a psychologist. I started studying kids and adults in all kinds of super challenging settings. And in every study, my question was, who is successful here and why? My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. We studied rookie teachers working in really tough neighborhoods, asking which teachers are still going to be here in teaching by the end of the school year. And of those, Who will be the most effective at improving learning outcomes for their students? We partnered with private companies asking which of these salespeople is going to keep their jobs and who's going to earn the most money. In all those very different contexts, one characteristic emerged as a significant predictor of success. And it wasn't social intelligence, it wasn't good looks, physical health, and it wasn't IQ. It was grit. Grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future, day in, day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years, and working really hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. A few years ago, I started studying grit in the Chicago public schools. I asked thousands of high school juniors to take grit questionnaires and then waited around more than a year to see who would graduate. Turns out that grittier kids were significantly more likely to graduate, even when I matched them on every characteristic I could measure, things like family income, standardized achievement test scores, even how safe kids felt when they were at school. So it's not just at West Point or the National Spelling Bee that grit matters, it's also in school, especially for kids at risk for dropping out. To me, the most shocking thing about grit is how little we know, how little science knows about building it. Every day, parents and teachers ask me, how do I build grit in kids? What do I do to teach kids a solid work ethic? How do I keep them motivated for the long run? The honest answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that talent doesn't make you gritty. Our data show very clearly that there are many talented individuals who simply do not follow through on their commitments. In fact, in our data, grit is usually unrelated or even inversely related to measures of talent. So far, the best idea I've heard about building grit in kids is something called growth mindset. This is an idea developed at Stanford University by Carol Dweck, and it is the belief that the ability to learn is not fixed, that it can change with your effort. Dr. Dweck has shown that when kids read and learn about the brain and how it changes and grows in response to challenge, they're much more likely to persevere when they fail because they don't believe that failure is a permanent condition. So growth mindset is a great idea for building grit, but we need more. And that's where I'm going to end my remarks, because that's where we are. That's the work that stands before us. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and we need to test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. In other words, we need to be gritty about getting our kids grittier. Thank you.
So thank you for joining us. I hope that felt inspiring. If you have any questions or like to continue the conversation, you're welcome to contact Kapil or I. We're both counselors at the University Counseling Center. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Hold on, I think I have to conclude to save it, but then do you want to jump on again and process?
Yeah, let's do that.